we had both the nomination of a new president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who expressed the ambition to move from a political commission to already a geopolitical commission, which proved very timely in the light of the major challenges and crises which were to unfold. Her College of Commissioners was confirmed later in the autumn, and the new president of the European Council and the new High Representative also, of course, took office before Christmas. Then we were hit by the double whammy of Brexit actually happening at the end of January this year, and the coronavirus crisis, which accelerated during the course of March. And since then, as you know very well, the EU institutions essentially have been in lockdown. Digital meetings, teleworking have become the norm, and that's affected the capacity of them to operate in the way that classically is portrayed. We have this afternoon, I think, what can genuinely be described as a world-class panel. In Brussels, we have Heather GRABBE, who's director of the Open Society European Institute and has previously worked in the European Commission as a senior policy advisor, as well as a think tanker in different roles in London and Brussels over the years. We have Brigid LAFFAN, who is director and professor at the Robert Schuman Centre at the European University Institute in Florence, and is one of Europe's leading experts on EU policy and politics, and particularly the budgetary process in the European Union. Olivier COSTA, who's director and professor for European Political and Governance Studies at the College of Europe in Bruges, and also at CRNS in France, and has written widely on the European Parliament in particular. Martin Westlake, former Secretary-General of one of the EU bodies and institutions, the Economic and Social Committee, but has also had the privilege over his career to work in the European Commission and in the Council Secretariat, as well as starting that parcours in the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. And he's a visiting professor both at the College of Europe in Bruges and a visiting professor in practice at the LSE in London. And Uwe Perter, who's now Professor of Empirical Research on Europe at the Europa Universität in Flensburg, and is one of Europe's leading analysts of the Council of Ministers. And he's written both about the Council and the European Council and the Eurogroup in recent publications. And then it's a special privilege to be joined live from the United States, where it's early in the morning, by Andrew Marashik, a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University and director of the Princeton EU program, and of course is one of the world's leading experts on the evolution of EU institutions throughout the entire post-war and indeed post-wall eras, with his landmark book, The Choice for Europe. And I think you're doing a little bit of an update on that, and hopefully in that context to hear from the Brussels scene how people here in this city see the evolution of the EU institutions may be helpful and valuable to you. And he's going to react to the various comments and put them in a slightly broader perspective. Now, you didn't come and tune in, and we're now 112 people online to hear from me. So I'm going to ask our panel, one by one, in the order I've just read out, if they would like to share their thinking on how they think the EU political system has been changing since last year, the new institutional dynamics which are shaping the EU political system. And so first over to Heather.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and very good to be with you all this afternoon. We're coming to the end of a tumultuous year, even more so than usual. It's difficult to know what more could hit us in 2020, and it's a good moment to take stock of how much things have changed at EU level. And this afternoon's focus on the broad institutional dynamics in the past year is a very good opportunity to do that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the broad trends that we've seen, particularly in the role of the Commission. Looking, first of all, at the move from the political commission to a geopolitical commission, as Ursula von der Leyen, the new president who arrived last year, put it. And then I'm going to talk about the current crisis on rule of law and what that means for institutional dynamics going forward, and what it tells us about institutional dynamics that have been gathering for some time. So first of all, if we just think back only 3 years ago, it now seems like a lifetime ago, to the Juncker Commission's famous white paper with its 5 scenarios for the EU's future. The priority was very clearly in that document still to the single market and to reducing regulation. That was what Juncker had declared himself running a political commission, and that was the interpretation of what the member states wanted and what the commission's role should be. Ursula von der Leyen tried to escape from that kind of political commission into a geopolitical commission, putting digital and climate policy at the center of her commission agenda. And this new title of a Europe that works for people, an economy that works for people, when she appointed her 3 executive vice presidents. And in her State of the Union address in September this year, she made some very interesting remarks which brought very new language into the Commission's agenda. She talked about planetary fragility, about needing to have a human economy, not a market economy or even a social market economy, but a human economy. And she said, "We will work for just globalization. I want Europe to be a global advocate for fairness." So this is a very different set of ambitions from better regulation, for example. And although she put forward the principle that there would be one in, one out for every new piece of regulation, in practice, that's not what's happened. In practice, the digital and climate agendas have very much put the Commission back in the driving seat. They've given the EU big, ambitious policy frameworks that will definitely span more than one institutional term, and they will require a lot of legislation. They already are. Look at what's going through at the moment with everything from the Digital Services Act to the climate law. And the European Green Deal in particular sets up a meta policy for the EU, which takes the Commission deeper into all kinds of policy areas, including ones that will be altering institutional dynamics. And I just give you 3 examples. The first is competition policy, long the sole competence of the Commission and still a closely guarded competence. And yet this year, because of the pandemic, the state aid taps have been turned on and the competition rules were relaxed in the initial stage of the pandemic in a way that then later alarmed the Commission enormously when Germany spent a huge amount of state aid, more than half of the total, and the amount of state aid total in the EU is in the trillions. That means, of course, that the Commission has had to try and put the worms back in the can. But it also has meant a general updating of competition policy, both because of the crisis and also to take account of the digital agenda, of the digital economy, where the lines on competition are more complicated. So that's an area where there's a lot more involved than just the Commission can deal with, and where controversy with the member states is bound to come sooner or later. Another area where there will be a very different set of approaches on the interlinkages between internal and external policies, which are becoming ever more complex. And may lead to institutional clashes because the European Green Deal sets out requirements and parameters for external policies that will definitely constrain the room for manoeuvre of the External Action Service and the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy. So look at how the Commission set out ambitions to build partnerships with other regions, starting with Africa, for global collective action on climate. And although EEAS is on board for that, the High Rep is on board for that, there is a risk that the Commission's foreign policy competences will grow because of the way that the externalities of the European Green Deal affect the rest of the world, and the Commission will need to be negotiating a number of areas, of course, in trade policy, which will also affect the room for manoeuvre of the External Action Service. There's a risk that it might be resigned to dealing with mountains and deserts, as used to be said of the Foreign Office in the UK when economic interests prevail. Now that climate becomes the top policy, it could have major impact on external policies. And it also has led the Commission into starting to revise policy areas that have been very long resistant to reform, and the Common Agricultural Policy is the main one I would highlight there. It's true that the Council and the Parliament managed to dilute the environmental provisions in the CAP reform that the Commission put forward, but the Commission then hardened its positions in the negotiations, saying that the reform needs to be in line with the Green Deal objectives. So these are very interesting and very major changes that we haven't seen over decades in agricultural policy. And finally, the Green Deal brings in potentially new ways of doing engagement with citizens. Commission presidents from Jacques Delors onwards have said we need to get closer to the citizens, we need to engage with citizens. But that's really happening with the Green Deal in a new way because of the ambition to do co-creation of policy. Next week, the Commission will be announcing a new way of engaging with citizens with the Climate Pact, and this could involve deliberative processes, new forms of participation. And this is not just a PR exercise, it's not just political communication. There's a potential for using the climate assemblies and the various grand débat type exercises for citizens to be involved in policy making on climate directly with the Commission. And of course, that raises questions about the role of representative democracy and of the European Parliament as the voice of the people. I won't go into this further, but I think now, because of time, but I think this is a very interesting new area that could be very positive, but it does raise questions about institutional dynamics. So now on to the rule of law crisis. This is about far more than just getting a normal budget deal done, and far more than about anti-corruption measures to protect EU taxpayers' money. The whole EU system is at risk now. That's no exaggeration. This is an absolutely huge change. It is, of course, the culmination of trends that have been there with the rule of law crisis that's been building up steam for about 5 years. But now it's really, really big. The first major negative trend is that the immediate need for a deal on releasing the money for countries to cope with the pandemic and to get the next 7-year multi-annual financial framework agreed is causing the kinds of negotiations in the European Council entirely behind closed doors that normally only happen because of a country being in dire financial straits, as we saw with the crisis after 2008. But this time, it's because of two ruling parties, Fidesz and PiS, which have broken the convention of and the treaty requirement, indeed, of sincere cooperation between member states by holding this massive and urgent amount of money to ransom in order to protect their party interests in receiving EU funds on terms that suit their parties and suit the supporters of their parties. This kind of total veto tactic on a really big EU deal is very rare. It has happened only a few times before in the Union. Berlusconi tried it, but was talked down. And of course, the UK did it twice, under John Major with the non-cooperation policy, and then later with David Cameron on the fiscal veto. And ultimately, that led to the country leaving the European Union. It either led, in the case of Berlusconi, of course, the Prime Minister left office ultimately, but in the case of the UK, that led to a fundamental break. So what happens in the case of Hungary and Poland, where there's still massive support among the population to remain members of the EU, but where the governments show no sign of backing down? Well, it looks like there may be a deal. I'm hearing about very interesting moves under the terms of enhanced cooperation, which would be a major break in terms of a financial deal. But there are several institutional dynamic consequences that I think we should take into account. The first one is that the classic tactic to get a deal between all of the member states on money of constructive ambiguity did not work. In fact, the whole EU is now paying the price of the vague language on conditionality of EU funds on respect of the rule of law that was in the European Council conclusions in July. And even if there's now a deal on the next generation EU under enhanced cooperation, it will be much harder to regain a consensus now that two outrider member states have called the bluff on unity and have had a very public row about it, and even signed a letter in which they said they would back each other up and not accept a deal that was unacceptable to one government. And they also, absolutely key is the way both governments have doubled down on the violations of the rule of law and the deterioration in fundamental rights and freedoms at home during this period since the July conclusions. They didn't take those conclusions as a sign to change course. On the contrary, they've been abusing emergency powers, attacking civil society, media pluralism, academic freedom, judicial independence, the rights of women, LGBTI people, the Roma, asylum seekers, and so on. And it's true there are rule of law issues in other member states too, but not on this scale and not with these consequences for the whole EU. And just to finish, the longer term impact on the whole community of law that underpins the EU and underpins the single market is really going to be enormous. The EU can no longer continue the traditional approach of seeing rule of law as a value, but ultimately a matter of national competence. We've seen the way that only yesterday there are new instructions to Polish judges about not complying with European arrest warrants if the government doesn't like them. We've also seen how another member state, Ireland, a judge refused to send somebody for trial in Poland because this person could not be assured of a fair trial because of the lack of independence of the judiciary. This starts to have a big impact on issues like enforcement of contract, which companies across the EU rely on to do business across borders. Now, I won't go into all the reasons why the EU has been so reluctant to act on this. This is built up very slowly as a crisis on which member states were extremely reluctant to get involved and avoided many times, not just opportunities, but imperatives to get involved. Think about the Article 7 procedure, which may end up becoming a bargaining chip, for example, to get the deal. But it's also very interesting the way that the EU sought finally to give teeth to the commitment to rule of law and to stop these tactics by attaching them to money. And this backfired very badly because by then the governments, in both cases, the ruling parties, were so attached to their positions and to their ways of spending EU money that they simply were prepared to face down all the other 25 member states. And let's see what kind of compromise comes out of it. But the way that the rule of law still has a lot of instruments now attached to it, but still so little political will really to enforce it. And it's now the subject of a major split between the member states with, for example, the Dutch parliament weighing in trying to ensure a commitment. And of course, the southern member states not backing up Poland and Hungary because they need the money, but also because they are actually concerned about rule of law. This, I think, is going to mark institutional dynamics in the EU over the years to come. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much indeed, Heather. Extremely interesting. And we go now to Florence, where Brigid LAFFAN is going to give her perspective from the EUI. Over to you, Brigid.
Good afternoon, everyone. And as Heather has addressed the rule of law, I won't. I was going to, so I will, given a very comprehensive overview, I won't use my time that way. So let's begin. I want to say something about the Commission and then also interinstitutional collaboration. So on the Commission, I think it's important to say that the legacy of the Juncker Commission in terms of ways of working and prioritization has been extremely strong. So Juncker started with his 10 priorities, then new working methods, strengthening presidentialization within the Commission, all of the services in the Commission to do with the President, the Secretariat General, the DG Coms, all strengthened under Juncker. And that, in my view, has survived. The new working methods hierarchy within the Commission and the framing of the Commission, that sense of the strapline, political commission to the geopolitical commission. But I think the first thing I would say about the Commission is that for the first time, it is the leader of the Commission is a woman, and I think that's made a difference. I think it's made a difference in the projection of the Commission. There's a difference in tone, as Heather said, a difference in language. I am very struck by Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union speech when it was very personal. She spoke of Suad, a young refugee who 3 years after arriving in Europe has gained entry to medical school. She talked of Carola and Vittoria playing tennis across rooftops in southern Italy. It was a very different tone. And I think it also mattered that she was a medic for this particular crisis. So I think it's important for us to recognize that for the first time in the history of the EU, a top job is in the hands of a woman. A top institutional job is in the hands of a woman. Mind you, we have had European Parliament presidents, so I shouldn't. But I think this is a really important job. She also, the use of the strapline geopolitics was not to argue that everything the Commission would do would be about geopolitics, but rather a reminder that the international environment was pressing on Europe, and that the link between what the EU did internally and externally was very strong. And it was a recognition of the fundamental shifts in global politics that Europe has to address. She continued with the hierarchy. She continued with the internal organisation, the strengthening of the college versus the services, and of course she even sharpened prioritisation because she has fewer priorities. 10 went to 6: the Green Deal, digitalisation, the European way of life, Europe in the world, democracy, and so on. Now, I think that set of priorities aligned very much with what the leaders had been saying, their strategic documents. So in other words, the issue in Europe is not a conflict about what matters. It really is about how you can deliver on these big, very big horizontal policy areas such as the Green Deal and digitalisation. And I think the challenge in the EU now is not the demand for governance. It's clear where the demand is. But the question is, will the system be capable of delivering across all of those major areas? Now, I do think, and I agree with Heather when she says that this brings the Commission back. Why? Because the Commission is the EU's knowledge institution. It's where the expertise lies. And it is the institution that is capable of constructing the packages, the horizontal packages that go across all of these areas. So I do think that this phase, 2019, and over the next 5 years will be very demanding ones on the capacity of the Commission to produce policy and legal initiatives in all of these areas. I think they're all big ticket items. They're all complex. They all have an internal and external dimension. So I think the role of the Commission is extremely important at this juncture because of the transformative time that we're in. And the question is, will the Commission, both at a political level and also in terms of the services, in terms of the knowledge base, the expertise, will it be capable of generating that kind of meta policy making? And it's, in my view, it's a much more demanding agenda than the internal market agenda, which was equally cross-sectoral, because there it was basically getting rid of barriers, whereas this is very much building public policy, public instruments, and the toolkit. So I think it's a very interesting time for the Commission. How the Commission responded to COVID, despite the fact that it had to operate remotely, one has to look at all of the initiatives that it managed to put together in this period, all of the different responses, both on the health side, the medical side, but also then on the financial side, on the toolkit. So I would say that the Commission has shown this year in 2019 that it is capable of that cross-sectoral meta policy making, construction of packages. But then, of course, how this operates within the system is very much dependent on interinstitutional collaboration. And on interinstitutional collaboration, there is what I would call the bright side of the moon and the dark side of the moon. Firstly, the bright side of the moon. I think that the institutions have shown extremely high levels of interinstitutional collaboration in a number of fields. The Brexit negotiations, the Barnier method has really managed to bring together the member states, the European Parliament, the Commission, and the Council. And it is the level and intensity of engagement through these negotiations, in my view, are a very good model for the EU in future for all of its international negotiations. High levels of transparency, keeping all of the key stakeholders on board. For example, the Parliament is briefed twice a month, which is extremely intense, as are the member states, both through the permanent representatives, the working parties, and of course, the European Council. So I think that there needs to be a learning from how that interinstitutional collaboration worked and why it worked as effectively as it has. Secondly, I think in terms of the negotiations on the COVID response, this was an extremely contested issue, extremely difficult, and required a major shift in the preferences, particularly of Germany, and was a mega negotiation. So the Commission had to put on paper the MFF and the Next Generation EU, which was a very demanding task, but then it had to go into the Council to get an outcome in terms of that very long and torrid European Council in June, but it did. And then very intense negotiations with the Parliament on key issues, and the system did deliver. So that's the bright side of the moon. That's the interinstitutional collaboration that the system is capable of. And in my view, with the arrival of different roles, and I think here the president, having a president of the European Council does matter in terms of interinstitutional collaboration. But then where we are now, and this is, I won't repeat what Heather said, but we see a breakdown of the governance systems when two member states are holding the entire system to ransom. And it is as serious as Heather says, and it is one of the benefits of the MFF and Next Generation EU was the EU did not resort for the Recovery Fund to enhance cooperation. It didn't resort to a Eurozone solution. It opted for a solution a la 27. And now this is being called into question by Poland and by the behaviour of the Polish and Hungarian governments. And I think the member states have to see them off on this. They can't, yes, potentially solutions, but if necessary, they've got to go down the route of enhanced cooperation, because what you can't do, a couple of months of provisional 12s for the budget, which would be very serious for all EU spending programs, in my view, would be very dangerous at this precise moment. So it would be good either to go for enhanced cooperation or to get an agreement with Hungary and Poland without diluting the rule of law provisions. And it's not clear to me how that can be achieved. But I think that is, the system had a pretty good year and is having a pretty terrible last month.
Thank you very much indeed, Brigid, for those remarks. And if I might just add myself, I think your point about Germany is extremely important. I mean, Germany has used this presidency to engage in a very active way in terms of European leadership, very similar in a way to what happened in the first half of 1988, where Kohl shifted the emphasis on economic and monetary union with a commitment in principle with France to move in that direction, the budget, increase in own resources and so on, and CAP, and a greater openness to CAP reform on the part of the German government. And these things kind of unblocked the system after some years of stasis and took advantage, of course, of the momentum building up both with the Single Act and with the Single Market Programme. Thank you very much for those comments and reflections. Now we're going to move the discussion a little bit from the Commission to the European Parliament. And Olivier Costa, who's in Bruges, is going to share some of his thinking and indeed, I think, recent research on voting alignments and dynamics in the European Parliament. So over to Olivier.
Thank you so much, Anthony. So I would start by saying that when I started my PhD thesis, that was the time of the negotiation of the Treaty of Maastricht, and it was impossible to foresee what would be the institutional model of the EU. We had those very big debates at that time. And what is funny is that 30 years after, it's not much better. We all agree that there is a political system, that it's functional, but we still can propose very different approaches of it. And looking at the EU institution today, I must say that I'm a bit lost. Do we have the Spitzenkandidaten or don't we? What kind of institution is the Commission? What is the place of politics within the Commission, within the European Council, within the European Parliament? What is the overall logic of EU leaders' appointment? Is it about political coalition? Is it about just a balance? Is it about the qualities of people? And what drives the EU decision? Is it expertise, national interest, politics, neo-corporatism? I don't know. So maybe the conference on the future of Europe will bring some clarification on that side, but I'm not sure. So I will focus now on the European Parliament, because I think that studying the European Parliament is one way of understanding the overall logic of the EU by really looking how it works. Are we still in a system of division of power, a bit like in the USA, based on the competition between institutions, or are we moving towards a situation of fusion of power like in Germany and most member states? So that's a question, and so that's a bit our puzzle. So I will share now some slides. I think it works. Okay. Some slides. This is based on data I've gathered with Avenir Marier, who's a doctoral student at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And it's about a recent paper we did on the political dynamics within the European Parliament. So we went back to all the roll call vote data, which is nothing original. And the objective in that paper for us was to measure the degree of polarization within the European Parliament by looking at the degree of agreement between the EPP and the S&D group. So it's a very well-known story. And there are several explanations in the literature to account for that convergence between the EPP and the socialists. We have the institutional constraint. We have some ideological proximity when it comes to European integration. We have maybe the common interest of the two main groups to co-manage the European Parliament. Maybe the will of the group to join forces for the sake of the European Parliament in the interinstitutional competition. There are also routines linked to trilogue that help very much the two groups to work together. There is also now the growing need, and Martin will certainly address this one, of the two groups to work together to compete against the Eurosceptic. But there is also the formal coalition, the bloc, that was negotiated after the election 2014. And for the first time in the history of the EU, we had a formal coalition between the EPP, the S&D, and the ALDE group within the European Parliament, a coalition that went to an end in January 2017. And our point was to try to measure the impact of that coalition, formal coalition. So if we look at the overall votes in the European Parliament, we can see a decline. It's not huge, but it is there. After January 2017, a tendency of the two main groups to vote a bit less together as a result of the breakout of the coalition. Then we could have expected that the polarization was only for non-crucial votes, like initiatives or resolution, but not, because if we look at codecision files, that are the important stuff in the European Parliament, we see also a drop starting in 2017 as a result of the end of the formal coalition. We could also have expected that the polarization was stronger for maybe votes on parts of the text, the amendments or article, compared to final vote. We could imagine that for final vote there is more whipping or more media coverage or more staging. But if we look at the data, here we have the final vote in red and the vote on part of a text in blue or green, I don't know. And we see there is a decline in both cases. So in both cases, we have a decline in the overall capacity of the EPP and the S&D to vote together. So there was a real impact of the end of the coalition, and then a real impact of the existence of that coalition. The overall level of cooperation between the two groups is obviously high because the other constraints are still there, but there is something here. We thought that maybe there is a systematic decline in the level of cooperation through time in a given legislature, but if you control with the data from 2005 to 2020, you see that there is no systematic decline at some point in the legislature, and something very specific happened in January 2017 when the EPP and the SD got that fight over the president of the European Parliament. Then what can we say if you look at the recent period of time, the 2 last years? If we keep the same graph, we see that there is a very high level of cohesion between the EPP and the socialists, close to 100% when it comes to a final legislative vote. So this is mirroring the fact that we don't have a formal coalition, because in July 2019 there was no agreement signed by the two groups, but still the two groups, and even the Renew as well, played a very key role in the appointment of EU leaders, in the composition of the Commission, in the definition of the program of the Commission, and so we could expect that level of convergence between the two main groups, and we find it for final votes on legislation. Then what happened if we look at non-legislative text? For non-legislative text like resolution, there is no need for large majorities. Very often it's more controversial issues about values, international relation, environment. There is less coordination between the group, and there is no link with a legislative program or a deal with the Commission. If we look at the data, we see here that even for non-legislative votes, we have a very high level of cohesion between the EPP and the Socialists in the recent period of time, and sometimes close to 100%. So the question is the left-right cleavage dead? Do we have now a coalition of the Socialists and Christian Democrats voting always the same way? To see that, another way to look at things is, again, to go back to votes on parts of legislative text, articles, amendments, because there is less whipping, maybe less cooperation between the groups. But here again, we find a very high level of cooperation between the two groups. Over 75% of the votes were the same for EPP and the Socialists in the two last year. So there is a high degree of cooperation, whatever the matter. And in a way, we are back to the figures we had in 2016 with that formal coalition. Then if we look a bit more into detail, in the very last few months, we see that there was certainly a COVID effect, because at the beginning of the year, from February to let's say April, it was 100% of convergence, and now we are back to something a bit more normal in the 2 or 3 last months, because maybe the European Parliament has learned to work with COVID. Just to conclude on that, the situation today in the European Parliament is totally comparable to the one we had at the beginning of the previous legislature. That's from 2014 to the end of 2016. We had at that time a formal agreement of coalition. Today there is no coalition, but there is a situation of coalition de facto. So maybe the COVID had an impact on that. We know that after the COVID, we had a systematic use of the Article 163 of the internal rule, that's the urgency. We had less activities, we had less deliberation, we had less controversy. Also, it's a bit more difficult to have a dispute when everybody is behind a camera and not in the same rooms. We had less amendments. Maybe also there was a tendency to call, let's say, mainstream groups to support the action of Commission in times of difficulties, a sort of union sacrée within the European Parliament. But now, if we look at the data since September, we are back to something a bit more normal. So just to conclude, we still see today that tension that exists within the European Parliament between polarization, which we can see when we look at all votes together or votes on bits of text or the resolution, and a very consensual parliament when we look at final votes on pieces of legislation. But obviously we'll have to wait until the end of the term to see if we can speak really about a coalition de facto. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Olivier, for extremely stimulating presentation of the voting alignments. And we're going to move straight on now to Martin Westlake, who's I think also been reflecting on some of these issues and the dynamics in institutions more widely. So, Martin.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you to all of the previous speakers. I'm going to speed up some parts of my presentation so I don't duplicate what has already been said. And I don't wish in any way to belittle the policy side of, or the policy aspects of the current mandate that Heather and Brigid have spoken about so evocatively by concentrating more on interinstitutional relations. But nevertheless, I'd like to try and answer Olivier's question about the Spitzenkandidaten procedure by examining 2019 and what it might tell us about 2024. Now, in 2019, there were four developments which were of, sorry, my screen did something strange then. There were four developments in 2019 that were of particular interest in this context. One was Emmanuel Macron's movement, not a party, En Marche. Where would his MEPs go and with whom? And we know the answer. They went with the Liberals in the end and formed a new group, a new and inverted commas group, Renew. A second question, would the Spitzenkandidaten procedure work? And the answer was no, but, I would argue, and I will come back to that at the end of my little presentation. A third interesting aspect was the appointment of Ursula von der Leyen by the European Council. For the first time in a long time, she was not a former head of state or government. She was not one of them. And that in itself was quite a drastic departure from what had become tradition. And I agree with everything that Brigid said about the fact that Ursula von der Leyen is a woman at the head of an important institution for the first time. That's really important. A fourth aspect, which various speakers have referred to, is the numerical weakness of the EPP and the S&D groups, and therefore von der Leyen's reliance on a third group, which was Renew, or En Marche, behind the scenes, in order to get both her programme, herself and her programme and her college through. I'd like now to concentrate on what Brigid called the bright side of the moon, which is the traditional trends and dynamics in the interinstitutional triangle, as we call it. And I think they remain strong. There are a series of dynamics going on, which are both contradictory and compensatory. First, there are two reactionaries and a revolutionary. I'm exaggerating my case, of course, but the Council and the Commission were born, relatively speaking, with a full panoply of their powers and their role. But the Parliament, on the other hand, only really came into its own since 1979, and it's an institution on a hurry, determined to win its full place in the interinstitutional triangle. So it's a revolutionary compared to their reactionary behaviour at times. Then we have two federalists and an intergovernmentalist. The Parliament can only gain new powers from a federalist perspective. The Commission can only win legitimacy in a federalist perspective. And the Council, of course, earns its legitimacy primarily from the member states and from intergovernmentalism. And then we have two legislators and an initiator. The twin arms of the legislative and budgetary authority are the Parliament and the Council. The Commission is the initiator, although it's hemmed in increasingly by various sorts of restraints. So on a daily basis, and miraculously really, notwithstanding all of the rigors of COVID-19 and everything that it meant for the institutions in terms of their organization, the system continues to work well, the basic system. And I think also traditional trends and dynamics within the institutions remain strong. I don't want to say too much about the Council and the European Council, because we will cover all of that. And if I leave to one side the Article 7 conundrum that Heather and Brigid have spoken about, the basic imperative in the institution is consensus. And one of the remarkable aspects of Ursula von der Leyen's appointment in 2019 was that the European Council was able to decide unanimously in favour of her nomination. given all that had occurred in 2014 when Cameron and Orban voted against Jean-Claude Juncker. The Parliament, as Olivier has statistically demonstrated, its basic imperative is majoritarian. Due to exogenous factors, treaty articles in particular, it can only exercise its budgetary and legislative and appointing powers through the creation of absolute majorities, or indeed more in the case of the censure motion or the budgetary procedure. And that means, again, as Olivier has shown very graphically, that the Parliament is condemned to centrism. The figures just don't add up in terms of forming a left-wing or a right-wing majority. Hence Olivier's question about whether the politics has gone out of the left-right divide. And then last but not least, as Brigid quite rightly pointed out, the European Commission has been steadily presidentialized ever since, I would argue, the times of Jacques Delors. Jacques Delors was a presidential president, if I can put it like that, mainly because of his charisma, his force of will, his vision, and also the strong men and strong women that he assembled around him. But nowadays, the European Commission president has a series of treaty-based and rule-based powers that really have transformed the role from one of primus inter pares in a college to a president, a true president. And Brigid is absolutely right. Ursula von der Leyen took on board everything that Jean-Claude Juncker had done. And let's remember that all of that was considered revolutionary at the time. And without the visibility of, say, Martin Selmayr, she has, if anything, been more muscular about senior appointments in terms of appointments in key positions, chef de cabinet, and so on. So increased presidentialization of the European Commission. Now, Vinay, if you could show my table 1, please. This is Vinay as our wonderful technical support. Here you can see just the figures in red are the ones to be looking at. You'll see that since 2004, the majority of the EPP or the combined votes, seats rather, of the EPP and the S&D have been in decline. And as the previous speakers have pointed out, in 2019, they fell below the absolute themselves. Now, the last row there is taken from Politico's poll of polls a couple of days ago, and you can see that if anything, the trend is continuing. We're down to 43%. So the European Parliament is condemned to be centrist, as I said, and those figures demonstrate why. It was this absence of a majority of the S&D and the EPP, I would argue, that was the main news story of 2019, and not the one that the journalists speculated about, which was that the extreme right and the Eurosceptics were going to somehow coalesce. Vinay, if you could show the second slide, please. Okay, so the figures in red are from last year, and this is just trying to illustrate what I'm saying about potential coalitions vis-a-vis assembling an absolute majority. The more groups are in, the bigger the majority becomes, the more comfortable the majority becomes. But if you do the maths, you'll see that the only way that an absolute majority can be, a reliable absolute majority can be assembled is through the three largest groups in the parliament at the moment. And that leaves me, and I think that logic is going to hold still in 2024. Now, of course, I have to issue a big caveat here, because who knows what's going to happen between now and 2024. But that leads me to my conclusion. You can take the slides away now, Vinay, thank you. Which is that with or without the conference on the future of Europe, it seems to me that matters are teeing up rather nicely for the Spitzenkandidaten procedure in 2024. You remember at the beginning I said Spitzenkandidaten procedure had failed. Had it worked? No, but. Well, if you want to be, twist things around a bit, the EPP was the largest group. So you could say that the European Council did take into account the elections, which is the wording of Article 17 in the Treaty on European Union. Now, for the moment, it seems to me Ursula von der Leyen is playing a blinder. She is performing very strongly. She's an excellent communicator. She promised in her July 2019 speech before the Parliament that if anything, she was going to improve the Spitzenkandidaten procedure, not only in the context of the Future of Europe conference, by the way. And it occurs to me that if she wants a second mandate, and one would imagine that she would, it would help if she were to be the Spitzenkandidatin of the EPP and hence of the European Parliament. In fact, it's difficult to imagine that she would be able to have a second mandate without that. Now, if you think about it, renominating incumbent Commission presidents is something that the European Council has done on several occasions, Jacques Delors and José Manuel Barroso. And by 2024, Ursula von der Leyen will be one of them, because the president of the European Commission sits, as we know, in the European Council. So the Secretary General of the European Parliament, Klaus Welle, once said when talking about the Spitzenkandidaten procedure, once is an accident, twice is a tradition. Well, if in 2024 the Spitzenkandidaten comes back as a success, then that makes two. And who will care in 2024 whether there was a fudge in 2019? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. I should just remind everybody who's online, and we're about 166 people at the moment, that there's the opportunity to ask questions of the panelists, either individually or collectively. So please don't be shy in submitting those Q&A, or go to the Q&A function and submit your suggested question there. And they can either be picked up by me personally, and I can ask them on your behalf, or if you would like to intervene and be seen and ask your question in person, please just signal that and we'll try and see whether it's technically possible to do. So opportunity to do Q&A very shortly. And now we're going to move to the final panelists before we have reactions and a broader perspective from Andrew Moravcsik. Uwe Puerta, the Professor of Empirical Research at the Europa Universität Flensburg, who, as I mentioned earlier, is one of our leading experts in Europe on the role of the Council of Ministers and the European Council, and indeed the governance structures of the Eurozone. So over to you, Uwe.
Thanks so much, Anthony, and many thanks to all the previous speakers. This is just great material also for me to try to plug in the Council and also the European Council in the institutional puzzle. And I think some of the puzzles we came across, if there's plural, have to do a little bit with these two institutions. And I think also the question which you ask for the whole event, whether the sort of the political system as such is changing, I think is a quite interesting one, in a sense. What are our criteria for the system rather than individual policies or politicians changing? And I think we saw some evidence in the previous contribution that sometimes the changes in personnel, and Martin was just concluding on this, then of course can also indicate changes in the system. And here I think what is very interesting is that we sort of see this sort of dilemma for us as analysts of European integration, where to put certain developments. And I think one of these paradoxes perhaps of the recent developments in EU politics has to do with the empowerment of two institutions, and then the Commission comes in as a third, which are perhaps seen as adversaries. That's the European Council and the European Parliament. So both have been empowered throughout the Maastricht period, and I think we are seeing sort of some climax in the power they have assumed in the new system. And I think Brigid spoke a lot about interinstitutional relations, and I think partially the confusion about what the political system of the EU is at the moment. Olivier spoke about whether it's more fusion of power or separation of powers, has to do with the different policy areas we are looking at and the different the roles of the different institutions in these policy areas. And I think we see this sort of divide very much in the council, in the way that a division of labor has developed here between those council formations which more cater to these, what I refer to as new policy areas of the post-Maastricht period, so economic governance, foreign affairs. In particular, in the 90s, it was also employment policy and so on, social issues which are not so much on the agenda at the moment. But we also see that there are some major issues which are related to crisis management, in particular the budget now, fit into this aspect of European policymaking, while we have other dossiers, these sort of classical legislative stuff, regulatory issues. Just think about things like data protection, consumer protection, and so on and so forth, where we see the European Parliament really more or less emerging as a very important legislative chamber, also exercising quite some control over the Commission. And I think the Commission, we heard this in the previous interventions, has to adjust to this new system. And perhaps this would be my spin on the appointment of Mrs. von der Leyen. Probably it is exactly that this scenario was a little bit unpredictable, which provides evidence of that sort of power struggle which we are facing here, that on the one hand, a major source of power in the Union is the European Council. And the European Council is the institution which has saved the Union from breakup during the Euro crisis. And I would like to say that I think the July decision was another intervention of the European Council which saved the Union from breakup. And I'm not sure whether the European Council will ultimately save the Union from breakup with regard to the rule of law crisis. But I think I would agree with Hesse that this is a very serious issue. And perhaps that's also something about this very central role of the European Council, that there are some tensions in EU politics which persist and which then periodically, especially in these moments of a crisis where it's about burden sharing, where it's about holding together, escalate to a level where we really see a threat to the whole system, despite all the professionalism we see on the side of the EU institutions in managing crises. So here again, I think before talking about the Council in terms of the ministers, I think it's very important to see the centrality of the European Council as a sort of an ultimate decision maker, which has proved up until July that solidarity holds and that the EU can address this. But I think there is a new challenge, of course, now, because the July decision to some extent is compromised by the current situation. And of course, there is a template for what we might be witnessing with the 25, if it will be the 25 going it alone, and that's the fiscal treaty. We have the centrality of consensus. Of course, Martin emphasizes for the centrism of the European Parliament, but it's even more pronounced in the Council and in the European Council anyway. But I think what we have seen during the Euro crisis is that if the sort of survival of the Union or the Euro area in that respect is at stake, we might see the overwhelming majority breaking away from a smaller group of countries. But it would be a precedent, of course, to have two countries here at the same time. And again, we may brace ourselves or may want to brace ourselves for these countries being joined by others. We don't know that yet. That all can happen. But again, I think here the European Council so far has been a source of consensus, and it also has shown that it may escape these sort of dilemmas by circumventing a minority. Let's look at the Council, and here I think is part of the dilemma with regard to consensus. And as I mentioned, that is the rule of law problem is very fundamental. I think also that the fact that we are dealing with it for a number of years now, so it hasn't emerged just with this controversy, but it has been around for a very, very long time. And one of the institutions which should have done something about it, but which never did something about it in a meaningful way, is the Council. And I think that provides evidence of another problem, is that the EU has now institutionalized, and again, I think the crisis has shown it so far again, that it can rely on consensus in important Council formations. And especially in the Euro area where we see this, that it works, it now even has worked with ESM reform even with delay, but it came through. In the Foreign Affairs Council, however, consensus is also needed. And here you see already the link with the countries now being in the position to veto the budget deal or the response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic consequences. If you give up on consensus in one domain of the Council, you may face also the ability of the Council to make decisions in other domains. And some of the most important issues, of course, in EU governance now, which are so prominent, depend on it. Perhaps currently foreign policy isn't so central to the EU, but of course it's also exactly the problem that perhaps the Union has so far failed to make it more central and to be a more powerful and more forceful actor in that domain. So I think that consensus politics in the Council are part of the persistence of the rule of law crisis, which we see, and it would be a major step if the Council actually could, as Brigid said, face Hungary and Poland off, but I'm still very skeptical whether they will do this. I think what we also now see is that the Council itself has been sort of restructured over the last 20 years or so, and we see a pretty straightforward division of labor between sort of more executive council formations, or those focusing on policy coordination. And here we see a close alignment with the European Council in the sense that the European Council plays a supervisory role. It plays a supervisory role in relation to the Foreign Affairs Council. Just think about the sanctions against Belarus. It wasn't the ministers who made the final decision, but they actually referred it for a final decision to the European Council. So whenever there is wherever they cannot solve major issues, it goes up to the heads. And we have seen this throughout the Euro crisis, where almost all financial assistance packages were decided ultimately after they have been pre-negotiated by the Eurogroup, by the European Council, except for the one for Cyprus. So we see this more sort of cabinet governance-like system where the European Council sort of acts like a collective president or even prime minister in the system, and we see the line ministers in the council, but not in all council formations, picking up that role. And here I think, before moving to a close, I think it's also important to think about the European Parliament again in this equation, and that perhaps brings me in the end back to Ursula von der Leyen in the Commission. I think the Parliament has been mainly powerless in these new areas of EU activities, while it has increased massively its powers in the other domains of decision making. So the classical single market portfolios, the regulatory governance, it has some powers in the budget, but we see now that the European Parliament here faces really the difficulty that is not a central player in the process. It's a player of importance, but it cannot ultimately influence the member states' difficulties in finding a consensus on the budget. So the budget hinges in the end on a decision of the European Council once again. And I think that explains to some extent that we see these continuing debate about the role of the President of the Commission. I think the presidentialization of the Commission ironically has two reasons. One is that, and perhaps that's evident in Juncker's statement when he came to power or came into office, he said that's the last chance for the Commission. I read this as a statement towards the Commission being seen as catering towards the European Parliament, from which it derives its legitimacy, and basically the Commission serving Europe's citizens. But at the same time, of course, the European Commission serves also the European Council, but it's also a member, as it was mentioned before, of the European Council, in particular the Commission President. So if you want to be influential in the European Council, then you want to have your own house under control, and you want to be able to make promises in the European Council as much as heads of government of state make or try to make promises in the European Council. And I think that's also part of that process of presidentialization. On the one hand, the Commission needs to communicate in a more forceful and coherent way, and at the same time, it needs to be an interlocutor of the European Parliament and needs to exercise its executive powers rather jointly with the Council than in total separation to it. And perhaps that's also a part of the reason why we are seeing that sort of centralization, let's say, in the Commission. Many thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Uwe. And I think that last point is extremely important, namely the fact that the membership of by the President of the European Commission kind of implicates her or him in the general conclusions of the European Council and ties their hands to some degree, also get their own house in order, is an important part of the institutional interface which very few people kind of are aware of or think about very much. And it's become more pronounced in recent years. Of course, those who are criminologists of the European Council conclusions will notice that sometimes in a European Council conclusion, it says the heads of state and government reaffirmed something. And here it's not that they're acting outside the European Council, it was rather that there was effectively not the agreement of the President of the European Commission to whatever the proposition is. That's declined recently, but you saw it quite early on after the changes that were introduced in the Lisbon Treaty. Now we're going to go over to the United States and we're going to ask Andrew Moravcsik to give his comments and perspectives on the various views that have been expressed. How does he see it as part of the bigger picture?
Well, thanks very much for including me. I'm going to be relatively brief because I'd like to open it up to questions. My task is to put this in some global and historical perspective. And so I want to make two big points. The first is, this is, by historical standards, a relatively, and global standards today, optimistic conversation. Everybody in different ways is conceding or saying explicitly that the EU has worked pretty well over the past 5 years, actually. And this is new, because especially in Brussels, in my career of about 25 years studying this organization, it seems like its supporters are always saying the sky is falling. Those who are most committed to Europe are always the first ones to say it's a total disaster here because they would like to see more action. But if you look at issues and big crises that the EU has faced, migration, Ukraine, the economic crisis, Brexit, dealing with Trump, grasping new issues which are really gnarly, climate, digital, and so on, the EU has done extraordinarily well by world standards over the past 5 years. Now, the exception, which Heather went to the old school sky is falling view on, is that Hungary and Poland and the Article 7 problem are going to bring it all to a halt. I'm more of an optimist on this too. I think I side with Brigid that I think it's pretty easy for Europeans actually to circumvent this through enhanced cooperation, and they will if they have to. My own view is that Orban is in real trouble internationally and increasingly domestically. And you have to remember that in those previous conflicts that Heather mentioned, the empty chair, the single act, and then also in some ways in the Schengen and the Euro, Europeans have grasped these kind of enhanced cooperation solutions and made them work. And I don't mean to belittle the problems of democratic legitimacy or transnational rule of law, but actually the EU has worked pretty well despite them up to this point. So that's the first point. This is all very optimistic by world standards. It's a good thing. Secondly, why? What are the institutional factors that have brought about this success? And here I loved Olivier starting with really a cri de coeur, saying, you know, we don't know what it is. We haven't solved any of these big issues. Really, what is the EU? We still don't know. So my view is it is what it always has been. It's a democratic polity in the sense that it represents people. It's responsive to things people want done. Like any political system, it has biases and quirks, but it reflects those pressures. And those democratic pressures don't come up primarily through the European Parliament, even though the European Parliament is more powerful. As Olivier and Martin say in different ways, the EP is structurally condemned to be a relatively consensual organization. And although it's sporadically important, it's rarely really decisive. Here, I think Uwe is right. democratic representation comes ultimately through the member states, and they are the people who hold power in the European Union at the end of the day. The Council and the European Council are the dominant institutions. They always have been, and they always will be. It's interesting over the past 25 years that the trend has actually gone in this direction, right? The Commission has declined in external power vis-a-vis other institutions. The Parliament has increased slightly, but the big shift in long-term constitutional terms is the emergence of the European Council and the Council of Ministers as dominant. And people are now adapting to that in what I think is a very healthy way. People in Brussels have come to see, as Brigid, Uwe, and others hinted, that progress doesn't occur because supranational institutions gain autonomy and impose priorities on the member states. It occurs because the Commission learns how to align itself and provide services and forge consensus among those member states. And over the past 10 years, the Commission has made a lot of progress in this regard. And I would interpret much of what we see, the presidentialization, the pragmatism, the politicization in a sort of bureaucratic sense, this ability to learn to work interinstitutionally as ways of fulfilling that mandate in an optimal way. And it is still doing so. And I view this as extremely optimistic, again, for the future of Europe. And I think a great example, which Heather raised right at the start, but we should go back to, is the issue of globalization. Because increasing numbers of issues that the EU is grasping, take digital things, competition, investment controls, Green New Deal, and so on, have very large international dimensions. So globalization as a whole is something that one is dealing with increasingly. This is true in the United States as well, whether or not you're dealing with what you think is, in a narrow sense, an international or third-party issue. And here I think the European Union has really moved over the past 10 or 15 years in a very promising direction. First of all, it's increasingly justifying its actions, not in terms of some neoliberal view of increasing free trade, although it's been remarkably successful in the last 5 years, one should add, in negotiating free trade agreements with people while Trump was asleep at the switch. But they're increasingly justifying what they do and acting as a way of protecting Europeans, protecting them from digital interdependence, protecting them even from migration, much as it makes us uncomfortable to say that, protecting them from climate change, protecting them from a rogue United States, protecting them from China that's not democratic or open, protecting them from Russia. This is good. People want to understand globalization as protection as well as opportunity. And I think that more balanced message, which really wasn't there 20 years ago, is a big advantage. I'm a big fan of Ursula von der Leyen. I agree that being a woman helps. I think a lot of other things that she faces help, that she represents help. Being a left-wing conservative helps, kind of centrist position that can play both ways. Being a pragmatist by nature helps. Being a German helps. I think being who she is helps. But the most important thing is that she comes into the office as Jacques Delors came into the office, as Walter Hallstein came into the office, at a moment when there is a demand for policy action on big issues, which happen to be the kind of issues institutionally that the Commission can handle. Digital, climate, regulation, the things that everybody talked about. And these issues are also ripe internationally. Because despite all the problems in the United States, if you look at the priorities of the Biden administration's foreign policy, they look surprisingly like those that the Commission is going forward with. And in recent weeks, I would give the Commission very high marks for understanding this and grasping the opportunity. In past cases, and this is the last thing I'll say, in past cases where an American administration has come in, and I know this with some authority because I was involved in a lot of the Track 2 stuff in the past, the Commission has had real problems being pragmatic proactive, and presenting itself as an institution that's powerful, representing powerful states and with the ability to deliver. This is the way you need to speak to Americans and Chinese or anybody internationally if you want to get things done. And in this case, the Commission did come forward with a strong agenda, an agenda that speaks to American priorities and reached out very quickly. And the result is we're much further along down the curve of American-European cooperation, which is going to be important for all kinds of things, China, Russia, you name it, as well as digital stuff, tax avoidance, many, many issues, than we have been in previous cases where an administration comes into power in the United States. In fact, the normal trend was an administration comes in, they mess around for 4 years, and in the second term, they get along with the Europeans. Now we're starting the second week, and the guy isn't even president of the United States yet. So I think this is an example of how a commission aligned with the underlying preferences of the member states and able to work interinstitutionally effectively is a good thing. And that's why I think for the first time in my lifetime, I am hearing American policymakers saying, hey, we have these important issues, and the first thing we have to do is go talk to the Europeans because they have real expertise in how to deal with them, and they're on the same page. And that's a good sign for the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew, for that. I think that last comment is extremely insightful. Essentially, the combination of Trump on the one hand and the sheer scale of the global issues is encouraging policymakers in America to think that Europe could be a partner in the same way as it's been encouraging Europe to get its act together, as the Americans have long wanted. Of course, Americans have been calling for Europe to get its act together for decades, really. Henry Kissinger, I think, back in the 60s commented that the US calls for a more united Europe, but sometimes recoils from the consequences of it. And we'll see how that particular dilemma plays itself out in Washington. Now, it's time for questions and answers. We've so far had 4 questions. If anybody would like to ask their question in person, please signal that to Joanna Apap. She's under the title, I think, Q&A management.
Put my name also there so they can write directly.
There you are, Joanna. That's great. So do it directly to Joanna, and we'll try and bring you in. The questions that have so far been posed really fall into 2 categories. One is kind of more narrowly institutional, and one is about Europe's place in the world. And the questions that we've had in respect of the institutional issues are from Gonzalo de Mendoza, on the one hand, and from Carlos Maruel Rodriguez on the other. And unless they would like to ask their questions in person, I will pose them for them. And one asks Brigid LAFFAN, and I suspect also Martin Westlake, because I know that they have rather different views on this subject, about the Spitzenkandidat process and how far the absence of von der Leyen being formally the Spitzenkandidat reduces the legitimacy of the president in office, and more widely, how far that is critical or not critical to the presidentialization of the office, which has been referred to. So perhaps you'd like to think about that. And then in parallel, Carlos asked the question, how important was consensus as opposed to dissensus in the way the Council was functioning, and more widely, to the potential for the European Union in terms of stresses and strains that could perhaps lead to its breakup. Of course, the breakup of the European Union has been foretold many times before, and so far only one member state left, which right from the start had a rather ambiguous relationship to it. So maybe I'll ask in the first instance Heather to come in, and then Brigid, and then Martin.
Thanks. Well, 2 interesting questions. I'll be brief. On the question of the Spitzenkandidaten, I have long been on record, in fact, since 2014, when I wrote a piece in the Financial Times on why the whole Spitzenkandidat system was a bad idea. basically because it's a form of fake democratic choice. Essentially, I've always thought that if the person is in the end going to be decided through a compromise between the parties and between the member states, then why go through the process of pretending that it's part of the European Parliament elections? Because it's not really. So either you should move to direct election, which has its demerits as well, or you should simply have an appointment system like for example, the IMF and the World Bank. But what's interesting about Ursula von der Leyen's appointment is I don't think that her legitimacy has been reduced at all. There are certainly some people who were very annoyed about it, notably the Spitzenkandidaten themselves, who'd worked so hard to campaign in all of the member states and given up 9 months of their lives, only to be overridden. But she got her legitimacy because of exactly the points that Andrew Moravcik just raised, because A, she's German, B, she's a woman, C, she came in with a very pragmatic approach, and D, she actually took out key demands from the public that were clearly there, for example, for action on climate, and made them her own. And that's a matter of very decisive leadership and having a very big member state behind you, and being in tune with the zeitgeist rather than the formal procedure. And myself, I think that the answer is to get rid of the Spitzenkandidat system and introduce from the Commission appointment. Also because I think that the Commission President shouldn't be a partisan figure at all. That takes away from the Commission's ability to play its role as guardian of the treaties. I think that the party political side of it should be diminished and not grown up. But a way to continue the system that would be better is to make it the system for appointing the President of the European Parliament. That would be my proposal. On the consensus dissensus, I think that it does matter in the Council whether member states are prepared to do sincere cooperation or not. Because the EU, the whole point about a consensus-based system rather than, say, voting in the European Council is that in the end, every head of state or government needs to be able to go out to the press and say, I've got something that's good for our country and it's good for the whole EU. And when heads of state and government stop doing that, and express deep regret about decisions, they undermine what is essentially a cabinet system of collective responsibility. And it needs to be a system of collective responsibility because it's taking decisions which affect a huge number of people with the money of many different people, taxpayers in many different member states. And so I think that's why it really does matter. And in the past, the breakup of the EU happened because of the decisions of one member state, which was already, there were a lot of domestic politics in favor of that as well. Whereas I think now we're facing a very different kind of crisis where neither PiS nor Fidesz really wants to leave the EU. Rather, they want to disrupt it and break it up from the inside. So maintain the shell of the union with inside it their definition of sovereignty for member states, which means collective responsibility for gathering the money, but individual responsibility for spending it. And I think that is a much greater threat than Brexit ever was.
Thank you very much indeed. Brigid.
On the Spitzenkandidaten, can I say that a Spitzenkandidaten did not become president of the Commission this time because the European Parliament and the party groupings could not get their act together. They did not have a consensus on an individual. They're simply, the numbers weren't there. So if the European Parliament wants to influence the process and get their person selected by the European Council, then they've got to get the numbers. And that's why I agree with Martin. I don't think the Spitzenkandidaten process is over. And you could well see that the parties will be much more careful in their selection of potential candidates the next time round. I have some sympathy with what Heather said in terms of the fake dimension to this, but on the other hand, I disagree fundamentally on that the person can't be party political. The president of the Commission has to be a substantial politician, and you can't be a substantial politician without coming from a party family. So I just think it's politics. So, but I do think we could well see a Spitzenkandidat emerging the next time round. On the consensus dissensus, of course, both the Council and European Council always aims for consensus. But if one or two countries appear to become a structural problem in the EU, they will be bypassed by the others. Mechanisms will be found. No one or two countries in the end will be allowed hollow the EU from inside. It's not going to happen. And neither Poland nor Hungary are strong enough or powerful enough to be able to do it. Can they become very disruptive? Yes. Are they very disruptive? Yes. Do they pose a problem to the system? Absolutely. But they will not break the EU up.
Thank you very much. Martin?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said, basically. As a good academic, a pure academic, I'm neither for nor against the Spitzenkandidaten procedure, but it is there. And as Brigid has confirmed, I don't think it's going to go away. But I think it is characteristic of the European Union and its thinkers that they don't necessarily think things through fully. And I don't think in particular that people have thought about the longer term possible consequences of the Spitzenkandidaten procedure. And there I agree entirely with Heather about the potential risks that are out there. Let's not forget that in 2014, when it was introduced, it was supposed to raise turnout. And as we know, turnout actually went down slightly from 43% to 42.5%, I think. In 2019, on the other hand, turnout went up to 51% in the European elections. But I don't think we could honestly say with our hands on our hearts that it was because of the Spitzenkandidaten procedure. On the other hand, in the longer run, here I know Olivier and a member of our audience, Nathalie Brack, have been doing work on Euroscepticism within the European Parliament. I don't think we have thought through the potential consequences for a period when maybe Eurosceptics within the system will be on a rise and sufficiently coherent to represent a threat to the consensual model that we've been talking about. And there, Olivier, in 2017, very kindly allowed me to publish a Bruges working paper, which is called Possible Future European Union Party Political Systems, where I explained that if we look at what's happened, for example, in Italy, with Italy's various party political systems, or elsewhere in the world, we really should be thinking things through much more and not just thinking about the short term. As, for example, today, we've just been thinking about 2024.
Thank you very much for that, Martin. And the second couple of questions that we've received are more in the foreign policy field, and I'm going to ask Andrew and Uwe to comment specifically on this, which is, on the one hand, Dinos Stasnopoulos says, how far can the European Union find a place in our rapidly changing world dominated by China and the US without compromising on its political values? And I think that takes us to the whole issue of strategic autonomy. I mean, what is it? What do you do with it? And how far stepping up as a power player forces you to decide and prioritize between certain values which you hold dear. And Solène David comes in, I think, with a very effective question. How can the EU focus more on foreign affairs when the EU itself is considered by many member states to be an aspect of foreign affairs? Maybe Andrew.
These are great questions, and they are the big questions going forward. On the first one, compromising political values. You know, it's true. If you want to play in the foreign policy game, indeed, if you want to play in the political game, you can't be a purist. Europeans have always had, particularly those who favor the European project, have had difficulty speaking about power or influence or interests in a straightforward way. But that's what it's about. Just look at Ukraine. You know, if you thought about this as a historian 50 years from now, they're going to say the West, which 90% of the effort made was European, the West stepped into Ukraine, supported domestic allies, and took away from the Russian sphere of influence the country in the world that is closest to Russia militarily, economically, socially, historically, culturally, right? That's what happened in the last 6 years. And Europe did it actually in a way that I think is very consistent with European values, by supporting democracy, by supporting rule of law, by giving economic aid, by sanctioning Russia, without a single shot being fired by a European or the West against the Russians. We've prevailed at least in 93% of Ukraine, and that seems now permanent. So I think you can, if you're prepared to compromise a little bit your purity, you can achieve these things. So I'll leave that. I'll leave the other question for Uwe.
Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And I think there was also a question about consensus and dissensus in the council. Perhaps I can connect this. This was from Carlos, I guess, and Anthony, you mentioned that in the beginning. If I may react to that as well. Before coming back to foreign policy, I think on this question of dissensus and consensus in the council, I think the key point here is that, of course, dissensus in a sense is often the starting point. And the question is in how far individual members of the council are prepared then to engage in this sort of sometimes tedious processes of consensus seeking. And this is, I think, what we saw in the previous discussion, or the others mentioned that here the Hungarians and the Polish ministers now have increasingly materialized as members of council formations, where perhaps this ambition to seek consensus is limited, to say the least, if not obstructive. But also to have that in mind, we have seen that process for a number of years now. And for a long time, they have played in different ways in different council formations. So they have played with consensus in some of the council formations, and they have played against consensus in others. And I think what we are facing here, I think that is often easily dismissed in a sense that it seems so unlikely that the EU will unravel. But I think if we think about it in a different way, what we may see is that there are threats to the union as we know it. So a possible way out of that current situation is, of course, to continue with consensus and to do something which ultimately pleases these two countries. And that sort of prolongs that period where you have a prolonged and persistent threat against the rule of law, not only in these countries, but also to the EU as a whole, as previous speakers explained it. So that's one of my worries. It's not just the option to circumvent them and bypass them, where we have, of course, also a number of serious questions, because it's about the integrity of the institutions. And Brigid pointed to that, that of course we can think about the recovery fund as something done outside the framework. It's like the ESM or so. That's not difficult to imagine. But what happens to the multi-annual financial framework? If you want to veto it, you can do it, and you can create harm to the union. So this is a persistent problem. And if this attitude towards consensus seeking doesn't persist on the side of these governments, there's a serious problem. Heather said, and others I think also acknowledge that Fidesz and probably PiS still have the ambition to remain in the EU. I thought so for a long time. But look at the options of these two governments. What do they get with the new rule of law mechanism? There is no massive sanctioning because of their breaches of rule of law, but there is a real possibility that they are going to lose out on EU money. Yeah, so this is the problems we see in Hungary and now increasingly in Poland with independence of the judiciary, corruption, and so on and so forth. They are real. So I think it's not so unlikely that we will see legal disputes or disputes between the Commission and these countries should the new rule of law mechanism enter into force about spending also quite substantial amounts of money from the EU budget or the recovery fund in these countries. So this is something I think which is a little bit different from the conflict we were in 3 years ago, where there was no real prospect of actually losing out financially. And that is different. And I think the options also for these two governments are limited because they are facing opposition domestically. This is why they are doing this. They are not just doing this because they are authoritarians for ideological reasons, but they are doing this because they don't believe really in their ability to persist as governments or regimes through just the normal electoral process over a longer term. That's my worry.
Thank you for that. Olivier, do you have any thoughts on any of those questions posed so far?
Yeah, just very briefly, there's a whole discussion about the Spitzenkandidat and do we have them, don't we have them? It's very interesting because here we have very knowledgeable people who have very contrasted views on those issues. So there is no truth. It's just a matter of standpoint, whether we need that or not, whether the president of the commission should remain a kind of a super civil servant or become a politician, whatever. And personally, I don't really have a point of view because you can advocate for both solutions, etc. What I'm concerned about is the matter of readability of EU institutions. If we want now to stop integrating member states, but integrating maybe citizens, at some point we need clarity. And the treaties need to be a social contract, which is very clear. So I think it's really a priority now for the EU to clear that thing for the next for the next election and the one after, because I think it's a very strange situation to have that kind of flexible constitution and interpretation of rule that depends so much about the mood or the people, etc. This is not super democratic, and I really expect that the conference on the future of Europe will be able to clarify a bit that.
Thank you for that. We're running slightly over time, but I hope our panelists can stay with us a bit longer. And we've still got 135 people online, so I think the interest is there. I'm going to ask, if I may, a final question to all panelists, and I'd like you to answer, if you would, in less than 90 seconds. We're 1.5 years now into this 2019 to 24 EU political cycle. If we now fast forward another 3.5 years to the Euro elections in May and the new European Parliament that will take office presumably on the 1st of July 2024, how far would you project the trends that you have already identified forward? Or what else might you be thinking will act as a sort of countervailing force to constrain them? In other words, compared with now, where do you think the institutions will be 3.5 years from now? And maybe start with Martin.
Well, the short answer is yes, I think they will continue, because after all, as Andrew quite rightly said, the Commission at the moment and its president seem to be responding to citizens' real concerns and their real interests. And by the time we get, by 2024, hopefully COVID-19 will be behind us. The Commission in the end has come out of that crisis looking good, looking strong. On the multi-annual financial framework, also the Commission has appeared good and strong. And so I think she will head into that election, assuming that she does wish to stand again, as a very strong incumbent figure, in a sense, not unlike Jacques Delors, who was a safe pair of hands, who could get on with the European Council and who could get the job done, and therefore had the backing both of the Parliament and of the Member States in the Council.
Thank you. Brigid?
I think that cycle coincides also with the Biden presidency, and I would envisage that the EU will in fact enhance its engagement in global issues, particularly WTO, multilateralism, China, and the relationship with the United States. That I think we'll see a lot of action in that space.
Thank you. Heather?
I agree with that, and in fact, the time frame you've suggested, Anthony, I think is a period of further optimism, as Andrew was calling it. But of course, after the next American election, that could all fall apart again. And so this is a really important time for the EU to be very active in building up more robust and resilient global governance. And I think that's where this trend of the Commission being in the driving seat on essentially setting the global norms, both on climate and on digital, will be absolutely critical. So that's really important. However, the EU's internal coherence could be very much threatened by what happens in the German federal election next year and then the French presidential election. Imagine a CDU old-timer who doesn't have the skills of Angela Merkel in cutting deals in the European Council and a Marine Le Pen type figure in France. Then we could have many fewer chances of gaining consensus at EU level.
Uwe?
Yeah, exactly. That was my point. I think Heather is absolutely right, because we think about individuals and institutions. We thought about von der Leyen and so on. And I think if we think about I certainly expect more dramatic meetings of the European Council about all the issues we talked about, and this will continue. I think also the economic crisis and consequences will deepen. That's what I'm expecting. I think there's a leftover or a hangover from the COVID-19 thing, which will hit the Eurozone, and they will need to deal with this. And then I think it depends on institutions like the European Councils, and the individuals there are going to change in one way or the other.
Olivier?
Yeah, we can say that a conference don't do European integration, but crises do European integration. And we have seen that in the last 15 years. So many things that were supposed to be totally impossible have been possible as a reaction to crisis. And now the EU is even close to become a sort of a federal state from a budgetary standpoint. The problem is that crises don't write treaties. So we need also at some point to move a step forward for that. And I really hope that the Conference on the Future of Europe will be able to help preparing for a new treaty.
And last but not least, over to Andrew in Princeton.
I'm also optimistic, not surprisingly. The trends we talked about, the change in issues, the increasing adaptation of the EU to its real politics are not going to change overnight. Heather's right that the big threat would be if you had very oppositional governments in major member states. But I think Emmanuel Macron's the luckiest man alive, because running against Marine Le Pen means he's 100% certain to win. She's a person who never has and never will have a chance of being president of France. Even re-electing Trump or a Trump equivalent in 2024 doesn't change things, as Ursula von der Leyen has gone out of her way to express to the Americans. Actually, the 4 years of standing up to the Americans strengthened the EU rather than weakened it. It's not good for global results. But for European integration, it's not a bad thing.
Thank you very much indeed to all our panelists for those very pithy insights, and for, I think, really taking the argument forward. This has been a fantastically intense primer on EU institutional change, and hopefully our panelists, as well as the many people who've been following online, have learned a great deal from it and have got great food for thought. So thank you so much. A big digital round of applause to you all. We really appreciate spending your time and sharing your thoughts with us, which is really wonderful. The next EPRS Policy Roundtable will in fact be next Tuesday early evening, 5 o'clock CET, and it's about the European economic recovery. What are the prospects for significant recovery in 2020? How far and how fast will that recovery go? And we've got the Director for Europe from the International Monetary Fund live from Washington, DC, and we've got a panel of economists introduced by our Vice President, Mr. Silva Pereira, who's responsible for the IMF and World Bank. So look forward to seeing many of you, I hope, at that time on Tuesday. And thank you once again, everybody, for a great discussion this afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.